Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to our third session of Everyday Theology. I hope these have been edifying and fun for you. Particularly last week, I thought that was a fun conversation. I've had fun doing them. We are going to shift gears a little bit today and do something maybe a little bit more serious. I don't know. But I thought, having a conversation about political advertising and narratives might be useful in a season where we are sort of overwhelmed by them. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And like I said, I'm digging. I've gone back in time a little bit so that we're not doing something particularly topical or controversial at the moment. I pulled some historic political ads that I think sort of really represent these ideas that we've talked about pretty well. So we can look at those and dissect them, and then you can do your own work as you sort of watch ads that are coming over the airwaves over the next few weeks. So all that said, let's jump in. All right. So first thing I want to talk about is what is the goal, or what are the goal of political ads, because there is a slight difference than what we've talked about thus far. When you're talking about a movie, there's not necessarily a particular goal or action that thing is trying to provoke the audience to do. When you're talking about advertising, and particularly political advertising, there is a specific goal, right? It's to get you to vote, and they do that in sort of one of two ways, really. The first is to make a positive case for the candidate that the ad is in support of, and the second way is to make the negative case against the opposing candidate. I've sort of focused more attention here in the first one today, although there certainly can be an argument that one of the ads sort of inherently does a little bit of the second one as well. But yeah, so we're going to spend most of our time talking about how these kind of paint a positive case for the candidate that they are supporting. All right, so there's a few ways that they do that. Also, while we're sort of beginning to think about how these ads function, it's important to remember that these are sort of 30 to 60 second spots, right? There's not a lot of time to communicate the idea or the theme or the action that they want to communicate. It's not like a 90-minute movie where you have a long time to let that idea develop. So the way that ads often work, right, is working in really broad strokes that try to provoke as much emotion from you as possible in a short amount of time. And they're going to do that primarily using sort of three major things: imagery and symbolism, right? So the images you see are going to attempt to be evocative, bring some emotion out in you. The language that you hear might have some sort of archetypal connections that sort of bring something out of it that connects it to a deeper tradition than what you're just seeing right there in that moment. And also the aural impression, right? Setting the mood is often a huge thing. I mean, lighting can be part of this too, but also the sound that you hear, and I think that's particularly the case in these two ads that we've selected, has a real impact on the emotional content of the piece. All right. So that's sort of an overview on how the ads themselves work. And then let's review for just a second again some of the ideas, our touch points for how we're analyzing them. The first day I gave you those 10 sort of questions to ask or comments to think about as you're dissecting or exegeting a cultural artifact. We could do all 10 of them for these, but given that we don't want to be here all day, I've picked 5 that I think are especially present in these two ads, and we'll sort of dissect them as we go. All right. So without further ado, let's jump into our first ad. So our first ad is a Hillary Clinton ad from her primary campaign against Barack Obama in 2008. It's officially titled Children, though it came to be known as like the 3 a.m. phone call more colloquially. But I give you the official name because I do think that that's really important. And we will talk about that in a few minutes. But let's go ahead and watch the ad first.
It's 3 a.m. and your children are safe and asleep. But there's a phone in the White House and it's ringing. Something's happening in the world. Your vote will decide who answers that call. Whether it's someone who already knows the world's leaders, knows the military, someone tested and ready to lead in a dangerous world. It's 3 a.m. and your children are safe and asleep. Who do you want answering the phone?
I'm Hillary Clinton, and I approve this message.
Awesome. Okay, so it's 3 a.m. and your children are safe and asleep. Who do you want answering the call? So let's think about, before we apply our categories to it, let's break down sort of what it's doing first, right? First thing, one of the first impressions I had watching this, right, was that what I talked about, that aural impression, right? The music is kind of complicated. There's kind of like an undertone that is a bit dark, right? And over top of it is this kind of very presidential sounding fanfare-esque, right, or orchestration that sort of, to me, gives me the sense that like there is danger in the world that this leader can keep at bay, right? Like quite literally, there's this one thing over top of this other thing, it feels like, and the leader is holding the world in order, right? So I think that, that's something that we don't talk about or think about a lot, but like you feel it, right? Secondly, I think there is a sense in which this the language being used in this ad is very evocative, like 3 a.m. in the morning. Only bad things happen at night, right? Like no one calls and wakes us up at 3 a.m. unless it's an emergency, right? So that is such an evocative feeling to like a phone call ringing at 3 a.m. What terrible could be happening? And then last, I want to talk about the images, right? So we're the images of these sleeping children, right? Like, is there anything more evocative than that? Like the innocence that we want to protect, right? It's meant to like sort of bring something out in you. And I would suggest that what it is attempting to bring out in you, so what is it doing in addition to what it's saying, is I think that it is intended in some ways to instill fear in us, right? Like it's not necessarily over the top. There are some other ones I could have like pulled at that are a bit more intense in this direction. I don't know, like particularly like the Willie Horton ad from Bush's campaign against Dukakis, right? Like that was very much a fear-based ad. We see lots of fear-based ads running now. It's definitely a trend. But yeah, I think that this ad is in some ways in that tradition. Like it is attempting to make you be fearful of what could happen to you or to your family, right? And in response to that, it is commending a certain thing about humanity. And that thing that I would suggest that this is sort of like the key to the whole ad, right, is what it is telling us is that competence and experience is the antidote to that fear, right? Hillary Clinton has the experience to take that 3 a.m. phone call and that that she will be ready for the job when it rings, right? That is the whole thing that ad is suggesting. Now, how does that sort of relate to what we think about fear as Christians? Because fear is the thing that comes up in the Bible quite a bit, right? I've noted some scriptural references for you that you might want to go through and think about on your own time. But the thing that I would highlight is when we think about fear from a Christian perspective, the scriptural witness is ultimately that the antidote to our fear is not really trust in humanity, right? But it's trust in God, right? God didn't give us a spirit of fear. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, right? These are the scriptural references that we have that talk about fear, right? And that it's our faith, our reliance on God that can settle those fears in us, right? Now, this doesn't mean to say that like human experience and competence isn't important. It is. Sure it is. I want a competent person taking that phone call at 3 a.m., don't you? But when an ad is working in these broad strokes, it's good to sort of like make sure that we are dissecting it a bit and knowing deep down that for us the true antidote to fear is not any human but is God. Make sense? Right. Let's jump to number 2. So our second ad that we're going to talk about is another really famous ad. It's the Morning in America ad from Ronald Reagan's 1984 campaign. This one's really fascinating to me, and it's become like sort of a big part of like the American ethos in some way. So let's watch it and then we'll talk about it.
It's morning again in America. Today, more men and women will go to work than ever before in our country's history. With interest rates at about half the record highs of 1980, nearly 2,000 families today will buy new homes, more than at any time in the past 4 years. This afternoon, 6,500 young men and women will be married. And with inflation at less than half of what it was just 4 years ago, they can look forward with confidence to the future. It's morning again in America. And under the leadership of President Reagan, our country is prouder and stronger and better. Why would we ever want to return to where we were less than 4 short years ago?
All right, it's morning in America, everyone. So let's talk a little bit about what this ad is doing. So let's read it for what it is first, and then interpret it. Okay, so this ad, number one, I think let's talk about this oral impression again, right? Like the underscoring of this is like sweeping and inspiring and peaceful, right? There's something beautiful and touching and calming about it, right? Which I think is part of the impression that it's trying to leave us, that like America's in a good place now. It's calm. Don't you like it this way, right? And then the images that it brings forth, right? We see lots of we see people, a happy couple getting married, people moving, people going to work, right? Like these are all things that make us feel sort of like proud about our country, like a flag being raised, right? These are very evocative things that I would think I think that they're about sort of like happiness and pride, right? And then it uses those words, right? It uses words like that in this ad, which I think gets to that language component, right? Pride and happiness. These are all things that this ad is trying to evoke in us. All right, so let's break it down a little bit with our categories. So one of the things that I think is really fascinating about this ad, right, is that it is playing into this sort of Americanized Judeo-Christian idea, archetypal story of creation, brokenness, and restoration, right? Like that is sort of what this ad is saying, is like America was a great place. It was Edenic, right? And then Jimmy Carter, he broke it 4 years ago. Our country was a mess, right? And under the leadership of Ronald Reagan, we have been restored, right? We have been restored to our greatness by this salvific figure, right? Let's break that down a little bit further and talk about the behind of and ahead of the text. And what's great about this is we can look ahead because we're looking back 35 years. So we can sort of see how it plays out, right? So behind the text, we're coming out of an economic instability, inflation of the 70s, right? These are things that the narrative of this story creates as or depicts as sort of unsettling or bad, right? And then Reagan comes in, the moment that we are in when this ad is made, he brings job creation, stability, all of this is coming in Reagan's first term. And then ahead of the text, we're seeing a couple of different things happen, right? We do in some ways see the prosperity that that Reagan projects, right? But but on the flip side, we also get 35 years later, we see an increased amount of economic inequality in this country, right? Which could be directly sort of traced to some of the policies that were enacted by Reagan. So when we're thinking about the image of shalom that that this ad promises, I think what it's very clearly talking about is economic prosperity, and I think it would like to make the claim that it's economic prosperity for all. I think looking back on it 35 years later, we can have some real questions about whether or not that narrative was true or false. So that's sort of like a breaking down of that ad for you. In general, I want to close us out with like a little bit of a conversation around this last question of like, what power does it serve? And I think this is really important when we're thinking about politics. So there's a really awesome article that I found when I was doing this research. It's on NBC News. It's 6 political ads that changed the game. And it's got these 2 ads and a handful more that you can watch these, not just the ads, but like some interviews with the people that were behind the making of them. And it's really enlightening, especially when you're thinking about like dissecting these ads for what they're doing and not just what they're saying. And so we'll if you find this intriguing at all, I really recommend Google that article and watch some of those videos, because it's really enlightening. But so the big thing that I would want to sort of point out, and why I bring that up, is when you hear people talk about why these ads are made, there's a couple of different layers to where it feels like the power is being served. Number one, there's obviously like the political powers, whether it's the individual candidate itself or the party that they are a part of that are being served in these ads. Overall, all of them are serving like sort of a dominant narrative around like government institutions in America, right? And that sort of power. There's economic interests at play here. So, for instance, I think one of the Reagan ad we just showed, one of the makers of it had this amazing quote where he talked about when they were choosing the narrator for that, they were looking for a specific kind of voice, like this calming but strong, smooth voice, right? One of the creators of the ad talks about how that voice made him a lot of money in his life, right? I mean, doesn't get more transparent than that, right? So so when we're thinking about what powers are being served, we got to think about where it's operating on all those different levels. And then just to sort of like close us up, I want to make one like sort of broad statement about maybe politics in general, which is that they are important, right? And they shape our society and have a huge impact on like our well-being, our neighbors' well-being, the well-being of our community. They're really important. But I think an equally important thing to keep in mind is that we serve a God who saw power through a different lens, right? Christ's example isn't one of wielding power through economic or political means, but one that flipped the script entirely, right? Christ did not wield power in like a self-aggrandizing way, but in a self-serving way. Sorry, it's not self-serving. Oh my gosh, but in a service way, in a service of others way, in a self-sacrificial way. So as we watch these ads over the next, how many weeks do we have left? I would just ask that you always sort of keep that in mind, that a Christian understanding of power, which is what a lot of politics is about, right, is different than a worldly understanding of power, where the world seeks to self-promote. Christ sought to self-sacrifice. And I think that the more that we can keep that in context as we're watching these ads, the more likely we are to be able to understand our role, both in the political scheme and in our communities. I think that's it for this week. Once again, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to drop them in the chat over the course of the week. And I don't know exactly where we're going to go next week. I haven't decided yet. Maybe some music, possibly. Maybe TV. I don't know. I'm gonna think on it a little bit and get back to you. It'll just be a surprise for next Sunday. But in the meantime, grace and peace to you, and stay well.